Chapter 3. Every hour wounds, the last one kills. Old saying. There was a thin young woman behind the counter at the Motel America. She told Shadow he had already been checked in by his friend, and gave him his rectangular plastic room key. She had pale blonde hair, and a rodent-like quality to her face that was most apparent when she looked suspicious and eased when she smiled. She refused to tell him Wednesday's room number and insisted on telephoning Wednesday on the house phone to let him know his guest was here. Wednesday came out of a room down the hall and beckoned to Shadow. "How was the funeral?" he asked. "It's over," said Shadow. "You want to talk about it?" "No," said Shadow. "Good," Wednesday grinned. "Too much talking these days. Talk, talk, talk. This country would get along much better if people learned how to suffer in silence." Wednesday led the way back to his room, which was across the hall from Shadow's. There were maps all over the room, unfolded, spread out on the bed, taped to the walls. Wednesday had drawn all over the maps, in bright marking pens, fluorescent greens and painful pinks and vivid oranges. "I got hijacked by a fat kid," said Shadow. "He says to tell you that you have been consigned to the dung heap of history, while people like him ride in their limos down the superhighways of life. Something like that." "What else not?" said Wednesday. "You know him?" Wednesday shrugged. "I know who he is." He sat down, heavily, on the room's only chair. "They don't have a clue," he said. "They don't have a fucking clue." "How much longer do you need to stay in town?" "I don't know. Maybe another week. I guess I need to wrap up Laura's affairs. Take care of the apartment, get rid of her clothes, all that. It'll drive her mother nuts, but the woman deserves it." Wednesday nodded his huge head. "Well, the sooner you're done, the sooner we can move out of Eagle Point. Good night." Shadow walked across the hall. His room was a duplicate of Wednesday's room, down to the print of a bloody sunset on the wall above the bed. He ordered a cheese and meatball pizza, and then he ran a bath, pouring all the motel's little plastic bottles of shampoo into the water, making it foam. He was too big to lie down in the bathtub, but he sat in it and luxuriated as best he could. Shadow had promised himself a bath when he got out of prison, and Shadow kept his promises. The pizza arrived shortly after he got out of the bath, and Shadow ate it, washing it down with a can of root beer. Shadow lay in bed thinking. This is my first bed as a free man, and the thought gave him less pleasure than he had imagined it would. He left the drapes open, watched the lights of the cars and of the fast food joints through the window glass, comforted to know that there was another world out there, one he could walk to any time he wanted. Shadow could have been in his bed at home, he thought, in the apartment that he had shared with Laura, in the bed that he had shared with Laura. But the thought of being there without her, surrounded by her things, her scent, her life, was simply too painful. Don't go there, thought Shadow. He decided to think about something else. He thought about coin tricks. Shadow knew that he did not have the personality to be a magician. He could not weave the stories that were so necessary for belief, nor did he wish to do card tricks, nor produce paper flowers. But he just wanted to manipulate coins. He liked the craft of it. He started to list the coin vanishes he had mastered, which reminded him of the coin he had tossed into Laura's grave, and then, in his head, Audrey was telling him that Laura had died with Robbie's cock in her mouth, and once again he felt a small hurt in his heart. Every hour wounds, the last one kills. Where had he heard that? He thought of Wednesday's comment and smiled, despite himself. Shadow had heard too many people telling each other not to repress their feelings, to let their emotions out, to let the pain go. Shadow thought there was a lot to be said for bottling up emotions. If you did it long enough and deep enough, he suspected, pretty soon you wouldn't feel anything at all. Sleep took him then, without Shadow noticing. He was walking through a room bigger than a city, and everywhere he looked there were statues and carvings and rough-hewn images. He was standing behind a statue of a woman-like thing. Her naked breasts hung flat and pendulous on her chest. Around her waist was a chain of severed hands. Both of her own hands held shiny, sharp knives, and instead of a head rising from her neck, there were twin serpents, their bodies arched, facing each other, ready to attack. There was something profoundly disturbing about the statue, a deep and violent wrongness. Shadow backed away from it. He began to walk through the hall. The carved eyes of those statues that had eyes seemed to follow his every step. In his dream, he realized that each statue had a name burned on the floor in front of it. The man with the white hair, with the necklace of teeth about his neck, holding a drum, was Lycodius. The broad-hipped woman with the monsters dropping from the vast gash between her legs was Hubar. The ram-headed man holding the golden ball was her chef. A precise voice, fussy and exact, was speaking to him in his dream, but he could see no one. These are the gods who have been forgotten, and now might as well be dead. They can be found only in dry histories. They are gone, all gone, but their names and their images remain with us. Shadow turned a corner, and he knew himself to be in another room, even vaster than the first. It went on further than the eye could see. Close to him was the skull of a mammoth, polished and brown, and a hairy ochre cloak being worn by a small woman with a deformed left hand. Next to that were 3 women, each carved from the same granite boulder, joined at the waist. Their faces had an unfinished, hasty look to them, although their breasts and genitalia had been carved with elaborate care. And there was a flightless bird which Shadow did not recognize, twice his height, with a beak like a vulture's, but with human arms, and on and on. The voice spoke once more, as if it were addressing a class, saying, "These are the gods who have passed out of memory. Even their names are lost. The people who worship them are as forgotten as their gods. Their totems have long since broken and cast down. Their last priest died without passing on their secrets. Gods die, and when they truly die, they are unmourned and unremembered. Ideas are more difficult to kill than people, but they can be killed in the end." There was a whispering noise that began, then, to run through the hall, a low susurrus that caused Shadow, in his dream, to experience a chilling and inexplicable fear. An all-enfolding panic took him, there in the halls of the gods whose very existence had been forgotten, octopus-faced gods and gods who were only mummified hands or falling rocks or forest fires. Shadow woke with his heart jackhammering in his chest, his forehead clammy, entirely awake. The red numerals on the bedside clock told him the time was 1:03 a.m. The light of the Motel America sign outside shone through his bedroom window. Disoriented, Shadow got up and walked into the tiny motel bathroom. He pissed without turning on the lights and returned to the bedroom. The dream was still fresh and vivid in his mind's eye, but he could not explain to himself why it had scared him so. The light that came into the room from outside was not bright, but Shadow's eyes had become used to the dark. There was a woman sitting on the side of his bed. He knew her. He would have known her in a crowd of 1,000 or of 100,000. She was still wearing the navy blue suit they had buried her in. Her voice was a whisper, but a familiar one. "I guess," said Laura, "you're going to ask what I'm doing here." Shadow said nothing. He sat down on the room's only chair, and finally asked, "Is that you?" "Yes," she said. "I'm cold, puppy." "You're dead, babe." "Yes," she said. "Yes, I am." She patted the bed next to her. "Come and sit by me," she said. "No," said Shadow. "I think I'll stay right here for now. We have some unresolved issues to address." "Like me being dead?" "Possibly, but I was thinking more of how you died. You and Robbie." "Oh," she said. "That." Shadow could smell, Or perhaps, he thought, he simply imagined that he smelled the odor of rot, of flowers and preservatives. His wife, his ex-wife, no, he corrected himself, his late wife, sat on the bed and stared at him, unblinking. "Puppy," she said, do you think you could possibly get me a cigarette?" "I thought you gave them up." "I did," she said, "but I'm no longer concerned about the health risks, and I thought it would calm my nerves. There's a machine in the lobby." Shadow pulled on his jeans and a t-shirt and went, barefoot, into the lobby. The night clerk was a middle-aged man reading a book by John Grisham. Shadow bought a pack of Virginia Slims from the machine. He asked the night clerk for a book of matches. "You're in a non-smoking room," said the clerk. "You make sure you open the window now." He passed Shadow a book of matches and a plastic ashtray with the Motel America logo on it. "Got it," said Shadow. He went back into his bedroom. She had stretched out now on the top of his rumpled covers. Shadow opened the window, then passed her the cigarettes and the matches. Her fingers were cold. She lit a match, and he saw that her nails, usually pristine, were battered and chewed, and there was mud under them. Laura lit the cigarette, inhaled, blew out the match. She took another puff. "I can't taste it," she said. "I don't think this is doing anything." "I'm sorry," he said. "Me too," said Laura. When she inhaled, the cigarette tip glowed, and he was able to see her face. "So," she said, "they let you out." "Yes." The tip of the cigarette glowed orange. "I'm still grateful. I should never have gotten you mixed up in it." "Well," he said, "I agreed to do it. I could have said no." He wondered why he wasn't scared of her, why a dream of a museum could leave him terrified while he seemed to be coping with a walking corpse without fear. "Yes," he said, "you should have, you big galoot." Smoke wreathed her face. She was very beautiful in the dim light. "You want to know about me and Robbie?" "I guess." She stubbed out the cigarette in the ashtray. "You were in prison," she said, "and I needed someone to talk to. I needed a shoulder to cry on. You weren't there. I was upset." "I'm sorry." Shadow realized something was different about her voice, and he tried to figure out what it was. "I know." "So we'd meet for coffee, talk about what we'd do when you got out of prison, how good it would be to see you again. He really liked you, you know. He was looking forward to giving you back your old job." "Yes." And then Audrey went to visit her sister for a week. This was, a year, 13 months after you'd gone away. Her voice lacked expression. Each word was flat and dull, like pebbles dropped, one by one, into a deep well. "Robbie came over. We got drunk together. We did it on the floor of the bedroom. It was good. It was really good." "I didn't need to hear that." "No? I'm sorry. It's harder to pick and choose when you're dead. It's like a photograph, you know. It doesn't matter as much. It matters to me." Laura lit another cigarette. Her movements were fluid and competent, not stiff. Shadow wondered, for a moment, if she were dead at all. Perhaps this was some kind of elaborate trick. "Yes," she said, "I can see that. Well, we carried on our affair, although we didn't call it that. We did not call it anything, for most of the last 2 years. Were you going to leave me for him?" "Why would I do that? You're my big bear. You're my puppy. You did what you did for me. I waited 3 years for you to come back to me. I love you." He stopped himself from saying, "I love you too." He wasn't going to say that, not anymore. "So what happened the other night? The night I was killed?" "Yes. Well, Robbie and I went out to talk about your welcome back surprise party. It would have been so good, and I told him we were done, finished. Then now that you were back, that was the way it had to be." "Thank you, babe." "You're welcome, darling." The ghost of a smile crossed her face. "We got maudlin. It was sweet. We got stupid. I got very drunk. He didn't. He had to drive. We were driving home, and I announced that I was going to give him a goodbye blowjob, one last time with feeling, and I unzipped his pants, and I did. Big mistake. Tell me about it." I knocked the gear shift with my shoulder, and then Robbie was trying to push me out of the way to put the car back in gear, and we were swerving, and there was a loud crunch, and I remember the world started to roll and to spin, and I thought, I'm going to die. It was very dispassionate, I remember that. I wasn't scared, and then I don't remember anything anymore. There was a smell like burning plastic. It was the cigarette. Shadow realized it had burned down to the filter. Laura did not seem to have noticed. What are you doing here, Laura? Can't a wife come and see her husband? You're dead. I went to see her funeral this afternoon. Yes, she stopped talking, stared into nothing. Shadow stood up and walked over to her. He took the smoldering cigarette butt from her fingers and threw it out the window. Well? Her eyes sought his. I don't know much more than I did when I was alive. Most of the stuff I know now I didn't know then I can't put into words. Normally people who die stay in their graves, said Shadow. Do they? Do they really, puppy? I used to think they did too. Now I'm not so sure. Perhaps. She climbed off the bed and walked over to the window. Her face, in the light of the motel sign, was as beautiful as it had ever been. The face of the woman he had gone to prison for. His heart hurt in his chest as if someone had taken it in a fist and squeezed. Laura? She did not look at him. You've gotten yourself mixed up in some bad things, Shadow. You're going to screw it up if someone isn't out there to watch for you. I'm watching out for you, and thank you for my present. What present? She reached into the pocket of her blouse and pulled out the gold coin he had thrown into the grave earlier that day. There was still black dirt on it. I may have to put it on a chain. It was very sweet of you. You're welcome. She turned then and looked him in the eyes, with eyes that seemed to both see and not see him. I think there are several aspects of our marriage we're going to have to work on. Babes, he told her, you're dead. That's one of those aspects, obviously. She paused. Okay, she said. I'm going now. It'll be better if I go. And, naturally and easily, she turned and put her hands on Shadow's shoulders, and went up on tiptoes to kiss him goodbye, as she had always kissed him goodbye. Awkwardly, he bent to kiss her on the cheek. But she moved her mouth as he did so, and pushed her lips against his. Her breath smelled, faintly, of mothballs. Laura's tongue flickered into Shadow's mouth. It was cold and dry, and it tasted of cigarettes and of bile. If Shadow had had any doubts as to whether his wife was dead or not, they ended then. He pulled back. I love you, she said simply. I'll be looking out for you. She walked over to the motel room door. There was a strange taste in his mouth. Get some sleep, puppy, she told him, and stay out of trouble. She opened the door to the hall. The fluorescent light in the hallways was not kind. Beneath it, Laura looked dead, but then it did that to everyone. You could have asked me to stay the night, she said, in her stone-cold voice. I don't think I could, said Shadow. You will, hon. Before this is all over, you will. She turned away from him and walked down the corridor. Shadow looked out of the doorway. The night clerk kept on reading his John Grisham novel and barely looked up as she walked past him. There was thick graveyard mud clinging to her shoes, and then she was gone. Shadow breathed out a slow sigh. His heart was pounding rhythmically in his chest. He walked across the hall and knocked on Wednesday's door. As he knocked, he got the weirdest notion that he was being buffeted by black wings, as if an enormous crow was flying through him, out into the hall and the world beyond. Wednesday opened the door. He had a white motel towel wrapped around his waist, but was otherwise naked. What the hell do you want? He asked. Something you should know, said Shadow. Maybe it was just a dream, but it wasn't. Or maybe I inhaled some of that fat kid's synthetic toad skin smoke. Or probably I'm just going mad. Yeah, spit it out, said Wednesday. I'm kind of in the middle of something here. Shadow glanced into the room. He could see there was someone on the bed watching him, a sheet pulled up over small breasts. Pale blonde hair, something radish about the face. He lowered his voice. I just saw my wife, he said. She was in my room. A ghost, you mean? You saw a ghost? No, not a ghost. She was solid. It was her. She's dead all right, but it wasn't any kind of ghost. I touched her. She kissed me. I see. Wednesday darted a look at the woman in the bed. Be right back, my dear, he said. They crossed the hall to Shadow's room. Wednesday turned on the lamps. He looked at the cigarette butt in the ashtray. He scratched his chest. His nipples were dark, old man nipples, and his chest hair was grizzled. There was a white scar down one side of his torso. He sniffed the air, then he shrugged. Okay, he said, so your dead wife showed up. You scared? A little. Very wise. The dead always give me the screaming memes. Anything else? I'm ready to leave Eagle Point. Laura's mother can sort out the apartment, all that. She hates me anyway. I'm ready to go when you are. Wednesday smiled. Good news, my boy. We'll leave in the morning. Now, you should get some sleep. I have some scotch in my room if you need some help sleeping. Yes? No, I'll be fine. Then do not disturb me further. I have a long night ahead of me. Good night, said Shadow. Exactly, said Wednesday, and he closed the door as he went out. Shadow sat down on the bed. The smell of cigarettes and preservatives lingered in the air. He wished that he were mourning Laura. It seemed more appropriate than being troubled by her, or, he admitted to himself now that she had gone, just a little scared by her. It was time to mourn. He turned the lights out and laid on the bed, and thought of Laura as she was before he went to prison. He remembered their marriage when they were young and happy and stupid and unable to keep their hands off each other. It had been a very long time since Shadow had cried, so long that he thought he had forgotten how. He had not even wept when his mother died, but he began to cry now, in painful, lurching sobs, and for the first time since he was a small boy, Shadow cried himself to sleep. Coming to America, A.D. 813. They navigated the Green Sea by stars and by shore, and when the shore was only a memory and the night sky was overcast and dark, they navigated by faith, and they called on the All-Father to bring them safely to land once more. A bad journey they had of it, their fingers numb with the shiver in their bones, not even wine could burn off. They would wake in the morning to see that the hoarfrost had touched their beards, and until the sun warmed them, they looked like old men, white-bearded before their time. Teeth were loosening and eyes were deep sunken in their sockets when they made landfall on the green land to the west. The men said, "We are far, far away from our homes and our hearths, far from the seas we know and the lands we love. Here on the edge of the world we will be forgotten by our gods." Their leader clambered to the top of the great rock, and he mocked them for their lack of faith. "The All-Father made the world," he shouted. "He built it with his hands from the shattered bones and the flesh of the Ymir, his grandfather. He placed Ymir's brains in the sky as clouds, and his salt blood became the seas we crossed. If he made the world, do you not realize that he created this land as well? And if we die here as men, shall we not be received into his hall?" And the men cheered and laughed. They set to, with a will, to build a hall out of split trees and mud, inside a small stockade of sharpened logs, although as far as they knew they were the only men in this new land. On the day that the hall was finished, there was a storm. Then, at midday, the sky at midday became as dark as night, and the sky was rent with forks of white flame, and the thunder crashes were so loud that the men were almost deafened by them, and the ship's cat they had brought with them for good fortune hid beneath their beached longboat. The storm was hard enough and vicious enough that the men laughed and clapped each other on the back, and they said, "The Thunderer is here with us, in this distant land," and they gave thanks and rejoiced and drank until they were reeling. In the smoky darkness of the hall, that night, the bard sang to them the old songs. He sang of Odin, the All-Father, who was sacrificed to himself as bravely and nobly as others were sacrificed to him. He sang of the 9 days that the All-Father hung from the world tree. his side pierced and dripping from the spear point's wound, and he sang them all the things the Allfather had learned in his agony, 9 names and 9 runes and twice 9 charms. When he told them of the spear piercing Odin's side, the bard shrieked in pain as the Allfather himself had called out in his agony, and all the men shivered, imagining his pain. They found the Skraeling the following day, which was the Allfather's own day. He was a small man, his long hair black as a crow's wing, his skin the color of rich red clay. He spoke in words none of them could understand, not even their bard who had been on the ship that had sailed through the Pillars of Hercules, and who could speak the trader's pidgin men spoke all across the Mediterranean. The stranger was dressed in feathers and furs, and there were small bones braided in his long hair. They led him into their encampment, and they gave him roasted meat to eat, and strong drink to quench his thirst. They laughed riotously at the man as he stumbled and sang, at the way his head rolled and lolled, and this on less than a drinking horn of mead. They gave him more drink, and soon enough he lay beneath the table with his head curled under his arm. Then they picked him up, a man at each shoulder, a man in each leg, carried him at shoulder height, the 4 men making him an 8-legged horse, and they carried him at the head of a procession to an ash tree on the hills overlooking the bay, where they put a rope around his neck and hung him high in the wind, their tribute to the Allfather, the gallows lord. The Skraeling's body swung in the wind, his face blackened, his tongue protruding, his eyes popping, his penis hard enough to hang a leather helmet on, while the men cheered and shouted and laughed, proud to be sending their sacrifice to the heavens. And the next day, when 2 huge ravens landed upon the Skraeling's corpse, one on each shoulder, and commenced to peck at its cheek and eyes, the men knew their sacrifice had been accepted. It was a long winter and they were hungry, but they were cheered at the thought that when spring came, they would send the boat back to the Northlands, and it would bring settlers and bring women. As the weather became colder and the days became shorter, some of the men took to searching for the Skraeling village, hoping to find food and women. They found nothing, save for the places where fires had been, where small encampments had been abandoned. One midwinter's day, when the sun was as distant and cold as a dull silver coin, they saw the remains of the Skraeling's body had been removed from the ash tree. That afternoon it began to snow in huge snowflakes. The men from the Northlands closed the gates of their encampment, retreated behind their wooden wall. The Skraeling war party fell upon them that night, 500 men to 30. They climbed the wall, and over the following 7 days, they killed each of the 30 men in 30 different ways, and the sailors were forgotten by history and their people. The wall they tore down, the war party, and the village they burned. The longboat, upside down and pulled high on the shingle, they also burned, hoping that the pale strangers had but one boat, and that by burning it they were ensuring that no other Northmen would come to their shores. It was more than 100 years before Leif the Fortunate, son of Eric the Red, rediscovered that land, which he would call Vineland. His gods were already waiting for him when he arrived, Tyr one-handed, and Grey Odin gallows god, and Thor of the Thunders. They were there. They were waiting.